Good morning. Thanks for coming and being part of this great forum. We have two great presenters today. Dr. Dave Tomasco, who's the director of Sarasota Bay Estuary, and then we have Ed Sherwood, who's the director of Tampa Bay Estuary Program. And what we're going to start off with is our founder of Suncoast Waterkeeper, Justin Bloom's going to do a short intro on the Waterkeeper organization. So welcome. And we hope that you gain a lot of valuable knowledge this morning. Justin?
Thanks. Thank you. Hi, thank you, everybody. What a great turnout, and I'm sure there are a lot of people online that are watching. This forum is really not so much about the Waterkeeper organizations, but I just wanted to very briefly let you know that this is a joint effort from Suncoast Waterkeeper and Tampa Bay Waterkeeper, both nonprofit organizations, part of the Waterkeeper Alliance. There are now 15 Waterkeepers in the state of Florida. Suncoast Waterkeeper started in 2012. We're based in Sarasota and represent our constituency is mainly Manatee and Sarasota counties and the coastal waterways. The Tampa Bay Waterkeeper started in 2017. I'm on the board of that, and it's based in St. Petersburg and covers Tampa Bay area waters, and a perfect segue to the executive directors of the estuary programs that really cover the same watersheds that we seek to protect, and really enjoy working with these great resources and helping to spread the valuable information that they have. So I think our role, we have a lot of roles. You guys probably know about some of our more advocacy and litigation, and this is not about litigation. This is not about advocacy today. This is really more about information. And so I'm very glad that you all are here, and I'm very happy to introduce our speakers, and Joe's going to actually take it back and do the brief introductions. And again, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Justin. We're going to try to allow both presenters to present. So we'll have Tampa Bay Estuary go first, then Sarasota Bay Estuary, and then we'll have questions and answers after that. If you've registered online, there was an opportunity for you to get an email yesterday to submit questions through our email, submit info@suncoastwaterkeeper.org, or you could also text it to the telephone number that we have of 941-876-8328. We'll open up the floor to dialogue after we take some questions from the audience, not only here but virtual. We have probably close to 100 people that have signed up virtually. So look at this crowd, double it, this very important issue. So, and to kick it off, for the forum on the red tide and harmful algae blooms, we have Ed Sherwood, who's our director for Tampa Bay Estuary. Lots of knowledge that he's going to share this morning that hopefully will be useful for all of you in figuring this situation out. It's just one of those horrific things that our community is going through, our region's going through. So Ed, good morning.
Thank you. I'm going to use this mic up here. Definitely appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak to you today. My goal is to kind of give you a little bit of introduction of who we are as estuary programs here in Southwest Florida, get a little bit into the background of what has been successful in terms of past bay recovery efforts, particularly in Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay, and then talk about some of the recent events and some of the setbacks we've been experiencing this year in 2021. So, we're very fortunate in this part of Florida to have 3 contiguous estuary programs: the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, and the Coastal and Heartland Estuary Partnership down in Charlotte Harbor. There's one other one in Florida, the Indian River Lagoon on the East Coast. But basically, the 2 estuary programs represented here today have been an important asset to the community, going back almost 30 years plus now. So actually this year is our 30th anniversary of our founding at the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. And it's really allowed us to reflect on the past 30 years and what the challenges we faced moving forward and how best to address the new challenges we face moving forward. So what an estuary of national significance means is that Congress designated us as such, and it allows us to leverage federal resources with local resources to address the needs of our place-based program. So our national estuary programs are non-regulatory. We use science to guide management and restoration activities. We're consensus-driven, basically getting people in the room talking with one another on solutions to our problems. And then ultimately, all of our work is supported by the partners represented by each of our estuary programs. So that's the county and city governments in our watershed, as well as our public and private partners that advise our different committees and consortiums. And really, what we develop and what we're charged to develop is an overall management plan. So we have a recipe book for how to get our bays back on track if we just follow those and put resources towards those key actions and strategies. And there's the three management plans of the Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, and Coastal and Heartland Estuary Partnership are highlighted there. But I would encourage you to go look at those management plans because we do have a plan of action. And really, our job is to use the limited amount of resources we have as an estuary program to catalyze action in our watersheds. And the actions have been varied in the past. And what has worked for us has really been a commitment to trying to control nutrient pollution to the Tampa Bay estuary. And we've been fairly successful over the past 30 years, but we've been coming to a significant turning point as of late. We know that our watershed is being developed. We know that there's continued pressures on coastal nutrient pollution to our watersheds. And really the solutions that we've used in the past 30 years, those were the low-hanging fruit that we were really able to address quite effectively, to the tune of spending about $2.5 billion towards the bay's restoration. And that has had a positive result. So we have had success in terms of restoring seagrasses. And we actually reached the peak of seagrasses in about 2014 in the Tampa Bay area, but now we've been seeing some warning signs of some setbacks in terms of loss of seagrasses, and we want to address those issues moving forward. So, over the past 25 plus years, with that $2.5 billion, we precluded about 430 tons of total nitrogen from entering Tampa Bay. That's a significant amount of nutrient loads that fuels algae blooms, that clouds water and allows seagrass not to proliferate. So our big picture up until this past year is looking at the pie of nutrient loads, and it's kind of hard to see on the slide, but the big pie on the left is basically the amount of nutrients that went into Tampa Bay in our bad old days in the 1970s. So the size of that pie is the amount. The smaller pie to the right is basically what has been going into the bay over the contemporary period for past 5 to 10 years. So it's shrunk significantly, and that's led to much of our success. We've had clear waters, as indicated by the middle graph. We've had clear waters that have allowed light to penetrate to the bay bottoms. And as I mentioned, we've been able to restore seagrasses to our coverage goal, and we really peaked in about the 2016 time period. And we've now gotten some indicators that there's cause for concerns. We've recently had a little bit of a setback in terms of seagrass coverage. That last bar on the right is us falling below our recovery goal as of the last assessment in 2020. And really, we know what the issue that caused that decline in seagrasses. It's been primarily driven by losses of seagrasses in one of our bay segments, the old Tampa Bay segment. There's been a persistent summertime bloom of another algal species called Pyridinium that has caused water quality issues of us not meeting targets to maintain adequate life to the bay bottom to promote continued seagrass recovery. So the setback we've seen from 2018 to 2020 and us falling below that recovery goal has been primarily driven by losses of seagrass in the upper old Tampa Bay segment. And as of late, that has been where a lot of our management and initiatives have been focused, because we know that not only is there still potentially nutrient issues up there, there's other physical alterations that are causing that particular algal species from blooming, particularly poor tidal circulation and flushing from that upper bay segment. So once the water gets in there, it sits there and cooks and allows this algal bloom to proliferate each and every summer. And we've been seeing this since about 2008 and 2009. So it's not new. This is stuff we've been working on. It's just going to take a significant amount of resources to address some of the issues up in that bay segment. And as I mentioned, that has been our focus up until about the 2021 period, and our attention has slightly shifted because of some of the issues we've experienced in 2021. I have, graphs up here on how much nutrients have been flowing in the bay for the different bay segments. And really, I just want to call the attention to the fourth graphic down and that red dotted line. So we've been experiencing really good water quality in lower and middle Tampa Bay for quite some time. That has allowed persistent and stable seagrasses to occur in our lower part of Tampa Bay. As we know, we had a significant event in March and April, and that really loaded a lot of nutrients into this portion of the bay segment. And that red dotted line represents basically about 200 tons of nitrogen going into lower Tampa Bay on an annual basis. So over an entire year, we expect about 200 tons of nitrogen going into that portion of Tampa Bay. What the issue has been is that, over a 9-day period, the bay got that same amount of load in about a 9 or 10-day period as a result of the emergency discharges to lower Tampa Bay. And this was, an emergency discharge to save life and property because of a failing containment area of the old Piney Point facility. And that has been a lingering issue in terms of the closure of this facility for quite some time. This isn't the first time, there's been a leak from this facility. But this one was quite significant in terms of the amount of nutrient loads and the type of nutrient load that went into the lower part of the bay, because it is basically high in ammonium, which is basically liquid fertilizer. And, we were not concerned that we would have immediate effects, and what we've, been trying to express to the community, what impacts we would experience from Piney Point would not occur for weeks to months ahead. And now we're a couple months past the Piney Point event, and we're kind of experiencing what the lasting effects of that large mass of nutrients in lower Tampa Bay are resulting. So, I put up here a circulation model that developed by the University of South Florida. This is actually I think the latest estimate for this week. So the lighter colored areas are where the plume of that initial discharge is still suspected to be occurring throughout Tampa Bay and into the near coastal waters. So the concentrations are much reduced from what was initially discharged into the bay, but there's still that mass of nutrients that are potentially feeding a lot of the primary production we've seen since the event occurred. And I think USF has estimated that there's still probably about 40 to 45% of that water still remaining in Tampa Bay. The other portion of that load is still affecting upper coast, as you're seeing up here on this model circulation. So, that was a significant concern for us, moving forward and trying to manage the bay's resources. We have a lot of sensitive seagrass areas where, we've had fairly good water quality in around the Cockroach Bay, Sarasota Bay, the lower bay area. And, we were very concerned that, with that initial nutrient load, we would see these water quality impacts that we're now experiencing throughout the latter part of 2021. And, what we tried to do is mobilize a response just to collect as much information as possible to understand what these interim and longer term impacts of the discharge would be. There's been a tremendous amount of effort in terms of the different county, public-private partners, university groups that have been out there collecting information and really tracking what the interim and long-term impacts of that initial discharge might mean for the Tampa Bay's ecology. And it started with collection of additional water quality data, but we're out there actually every other week also collecting seagrass and macroalgae information. So what has been also important is that we've had a really great baseline of information and monitoring that has been taking place in our watershed. So both Manatee County, Hillsborough County, Pinellas County have longstanding water quality collection efforts that go back decades in some cases. Hillsborough County has been collecting water quality in the bay going back to the early 1970s. So this has really given us a really good indication of what baseline conditions should be in the bay at this time period. And then with this additional data collection effort in response to the Piney Point event, we could actually assess how out of range those values are. And the data is just starting to come in. Again, another graphic on the right is the initial plume trajectory. The data on the left are basically those weekly data points representing chlorophyll A conditions through time. But any of the values that you see with a heavy weighted circle is basically out of range values. We are seeing a high amount of algal production in the bay since this event occurred, and this is has been atypical in this part of the bay as a result of this discharge. So as we continue to progress and see the different cycling of the algae species represented in the lower part of the bay, we're hoping that over time the blooms will become more and more in range of what the past historic conditions are. We just don't know how long that's going to take place. So right now we suspect that these nutrients are just being recycled through different algal blooms that we've been experiencing since about mid-April. And this graphic is a little bit complicated, but I'll walk you through it. This is basically the progression of that monitoring. On the top is basically cell counts of red tide. So we know that red tide was occurring further south of our region prior to the Piney Point discharge and made its way into the lower part of the bay at the end of April and early May. And since that time, we've just seen an intensification. So it actually was reaching bloom conditions in early June and in early July before Elsa. We definitely saw an explosion and sort of living with the fish kills that we're now experiencing. And what I could provide to you is that there's the right combination of both chemical and physical factors that promoted the intensification of the red tide in the lower part of the bay. We had that slug of nutrients early on, and that's represented by the second graphic. The concentrations went up real high, and then as the plume dispersed, the concentrations have went down. But there's been more nutrients in the lower part of the bay than what we've been able to assess in prior years. So we do have that fueling potentially any algal species that may occur in our bays right now. Also, what was unique to this year was that we had fairly saline conditions. The water was fairly salty throughout Tampa Bay. We didn't get much rain through April and May, and that really promoted and benefited red tide species from outcompeting other species, probably in that portion of lower Tampa Bay. And we haven't had increasing temperatures since the discharge event occurred. So it's really those combination of factors that has led to this intensification of red tide, particularly in Tampa Bay proper. And we've not seen bloom concentrations in middle and lower Tampa Bay at these levels since the early 1970s. So over 50 years, when we know we had really big issues in terms of nutrient loads into Tampa Bay, we have not seen the level of blooms and the concentrations since that time period. So this has really been an anomalous event in 2021 relative to a lot of the past data collection efforts that have taken place in response to recent red tide events. So we've been providing sort of these one-page snapshots of what the bay's conditions are and how it's been responding. As I mentioned, it's been a progression of different production of different algal species that has been occurring in the lower part of the bay. Initially, right after the discharge, there was a non-harmful algal diatom bloom right adjacent to where the discharge occurred. And then we've started seeing other response, and Dave will probably talk about these a little bit more in his presentation of proliferation of another macroalgae called Lingvia, particularly in Anna Maria Sound in upper Sarasota Bay. And we've also seen that in and around lower Tampa Bay as well. And then as we progress through May and early June, we've been seeing this intensification of red tide. So how long the red tide will last, we're unsure. This week, we actually saw some potential clearing in the lower part of the bay. The water quality has actually been improving. And whether or not this is just another boom and bust cycle of the algal production as we move forward through the rest of the rainy season. We're unsure at this point, but we're hoping that Tampa Bay's water quality will continue to improve through the rest of the rainy season. Unfortunately, that probably is not going to prove well for our coastal beaches because the physical conditions, the saltier waters are going to be on the beaches, and that's going to still probably favor additional red tide blooms throughout the next several months. So although the bay might improve, we might continue to see worsening conditions along our beach areas. And actually, with the change of winds probably through this weekend, I think Pinellas County is expecting significant impacts of red tide and has respiratory forecast warnings throughout their Pinellas County beach areas. So, those have been the scientific observations, but we also have heavily relied on a lot of the ancillary observations garnered from fishermen and just people recreating and boating on the water. You've experienced sort of these ancillary bloom conditions that have been fairly anomalous for 2021. We haven't seen blooms like this in quite some time. And again, I think we could all suspect that there's been enough fuel discharged in Tampa Bay to kind of fuel this progression of different algal production, at least through the past couple of months. And again, as we move through the wet season, how long that's going to last, we just need to continue to monitor and assess conditions as we move forward. I can't really give you a crystal ball guess on what the next couple of weeks are going to look like, but we know we're not out of the woods yet, and we have to stay vigilant in terms of managing the impacts as we're seeing them now from some of the red tide. So as I mentioned, we did see some clearing and in the lower part of the bay. This is the latest state map of red tide observations. So those white and yellow areas are basically the clearing, improving water quality. There's been lower red tide counts in the lower part of the bay, but we still see a presence of red tide in the central portion, particularly on the Hillsborough and Hillsborough County side and Cockroach Bay. And then, as I mentioned, with those onshore winds to this weekend, we're probably going to see worsening conditions along some of the coastal beach areas. And as you all know, and why we're all here, is there's been significant fish kills as a result of that persistent red tide event throughout Tampa Bay and in Upper Anna Maria Sound. So I think the latest estimate I've gotten was that Pinellas County has cleared somewhere on the order of 1,450 tons, and I'll have an updated estimate on the next slide. So some of the things I'm going to leave you with is sort of like the lessons learned and what we need to do moving forward over the longer view. And really, we knew Piney Point was an issue up until the emergency discharge event. We were looking at spending about 10 to 20 million on fully closing down that facility. We knew they were accumulating water, and the fix at that point was not minimal, but it was certainly a whole lot less than what we're facing now. Since the emergency discharge and dealing with the remaining processed water, we're likely to spend over $100 million to $200 million on full and final closure of that facility. And the longer we put that off, the more expensive it's going to get. So I think it's imperative that we continue to be vigilant and with full and final closure of that facility, because we know based on this event, that's redirecting much needed resources away from where we know we have issues, and particularly in Tampa Bay and what Dave's going to talk about in Sarasota Bay. So we could be using those resources on areas where we know we've had these persistent seagrass issues. Instead, we're focusing a lot of attention and resources towards this event. And really, what's upsetting, particularly from our long-standing partnerships forged through the estuary programs, is that there's been a significant amount of resources spent in our region to get our bays back on track. I threw the figure up there for Tampa Bay over that 25, 30-year period since the early 1990s. We invested $2.5 billion towards the bay's restoration. We can't let one event like this throw us off kilter and set us back significantly where we're heading down a path that would be similar to the Indian River Lagoon. It only took 1 to 2 years of bad water quality in the Indian River Lagoon to really set them back decades, and now they've been struggling for the past 10 years with water quality issues, persistent algal blooms that reoccur every year throughout their estuary watershed, and that is leading to fish kills there. It's now leading to potentially a mass mortality event for manatees because there's not enough seagrass resources for those manatees to feed on. We definitely don't want to emulate that situation here, so we need to get our bay back on track, and we need to get it back on track quickly. And certainly, this event also highlighted the need for additional research and monitoring. We've been doing a great job of monitoring water quality in Tampa Bay, but we do that on a monthly snapshot basis. So we've been relying on methods that go back to the 1970s. And this event, we know water quality has been changing, from week to week, and some of the large amount of effort that has been expended has been towards this more enhanced monitoring effort to really get an idea of the progression of the bay's condition. So we know we could do better. We know we can invest, in 21st century technologies to better provide monitoring and surveillance on the bay's condition as we move forward in understanding its recovery. And then, and just another warning sign that this is exposing to our region is that we know we're getting warmer waters throughout Southwest Florida. Any excess nutrients that we're adding to that is just compounding our issues in terms of allowing persistent, both harmful and nuisance algal blooms to occur in the future. So we need to address one of those situations immediately. We need to probably address both those situations over the long term a lot more proactively than we have, or else this is going to be our new normal on an annual basis. And red tide and harmful algal blooms have both an environmental impact, as we're all well aware of the amount of dead fish that have been collected in Tampa Bay so far. And then going back to 2018, we've collected up to 2,000 tons of dead fish during that event. And there's those environmental impacts, but there's also those economic impacts that we're now experiencing as a community. So businesses, restaurants, hotels are experiencing the economic ramifications of persistent and long-term water quality issues in our watersheds. And this is an old number. I actually got an update yesterday from Kelly Levy. She's now above about 1,450 tons of fish collected as of July 21st. And we still have about 2 months more to go of warm, rainy season. So that might mean a lot more dead fish washing shore in our region as we move forward. So we definitely want to take the right steps to address these lingering water quality issues in our region. And the long view I'll leave you with, there's not one solution to fix all our problems. There's really a host of investments that are needed moving forward. As I mentioned, significantly investing in research and monitoring to get an understanding of our bay's ecology moving forward, because it has evolved since our early restoration efforts in the 1990s. So the new challenges we face with the warming climate, with different and diffuse nutrient sources leading to our coastal environments, there's going to be new strategies needed to address those. And getting out to the community that we're all part of the problem, but we all are potentially the solutions to these issues. So if you look at it from a personal environmental footprint perspective, your little area, your yard, how you manage your yard has downstream effects of how we manage the bay. And collectively, the greater than 3.1 million people that now live in the Tampa Bay region, if we all work together, we could work on solutions that will have lasting impacts and get us back on track. So there's this community messaging that we've been focused on, to focus on your personal environmental footprint. But then there's those really big lifts that we need to invest in moving forward. So those new strategies to address the coastal nutrient pollution sources that are most significant in our watersheds. They're namely coming from the atmosphere, are coming from stormwater and non-point sources, and there are still some lingering point source issues that we need to deal with. And a lot of that is a lot of those issues are surrounding, at least in the Tampa Bay watershed, with aging infrastructure and addressing how we manage and treat both our wastewater and stormwater moving forward. And then the last thing to leave you with, if we don't, pave it over, if we don't pave over paradise, to steal a colloquium that's popular out there, if we keep things green instead of gray, then we have a whole lot better potential of hedging off some of these coastal nutrient pollution issues in the future. So there's also all these ancillary benefits in terms of fish habitat and stormwater filtering, that if we leave some of these areas natural, or if we think about innovative stormwater treatment technologies that integrate natural systems, urban stream restoration, moving forward, that should have a positive impact for the diffuse nutrient load that's coming from stormwater now into our coastal region. So again, this is a longer view thing, but these are where the investments really need to be made moving forward. And I think Dave's probably going to touch on a whole lot more of those things as he presents information on Sarasota Bay. So I do really appreciate the time to give you that update. Looking forward to some of the questions and answers as we move into that phase of the program. So thank you.
Thank you, Ed. We'll get Dave up here, and I just want to thank Ed for taking his time. And he's one of these people that came up from the ranks as a scientist with Tampa Bay Estuary, and now is leading the organization as a director. And his passion for this environment, you could see it. He's not a very excitable person typically, but he's very emotional about this, because we're about to lose paradise, and that's something that we're really concerned with. So, Dave, good morning.
Thanks a lot.
Dr. Tomasco.
Appreciate it. And thank you guys for showing up here. I know I've got Commissioner Kevin Van Ostenbridge here. I know we've got the county administrator here. There's probably a couple other people. If I was more politically astute, I would remember everyone's names. But the important thing here is local government showing up, because actually most of the heavy lifting has always been done by local governments in this area. We haven't turned to Tallahassee to ask us how to manage our bay. We haven't turned to Washington, D.C. The vast majority of the data collection efforts going back decades have been local governments. Manatee County, Sarasota County, Hillsborough County, Pinellas County, going out sampling the bay. The Seagrass maps that we talk about, it's from the Water Management District, okay? So the pollution reduction strategies are almost all like, what can the local government do? So really, if you have the local government behind what we're trying to do, that might be all you need, because that's all we've ever had. And so, I just want to give a shout out. If we take this really seriously, I think we can get in a better place. But I also want to let you know that there's an awful lot at stake here. So my presentation is kind of a little bit like a roller coaster. So there's going to be parts that's going to be pretty depressing, and parts going to be hopefully encouraging. I'm an optimistic person if we do the right things. If we don't do the right things, I'm not sure what this will look like in 30 years. So let's get going. So there's 28 NEPs, and a lot of NEPs, the main source of enjoyment is just looking at it, just being on a dock and looking out. But here, people like to get in the water, and this is what we do. This is what I do. Our family's not that sophisticated. We go out in the bay, we throw the anchor out, we jump in the water, and we play around for, the Saturday or Sunday or whatever. And that's what a lot of people do here. And when they get in the water, they want to be able to see their feet in waist-deep water, and they don't want to have rafts of macroalgae wrapping around them. So fish and crabs and shrimp, but also our quality of life, and also our economy. There's an economic uplift associated with, proximity to the bay, and you can just drive around with the Zillow app, and you can see people pay more, $1 per square foot, to live next to the bay than across the street. And they live more to live across the street than a couple blocks inland or a couple of miles inland. And the totality of that economic uplift on property values is $3 billion. So that has a big impact on the ability of local governments to be able to function, because as much of the tax base associated with property values, well, there's a property value uplift associated with living next to the water. And that's because the water is an amenity, but it's no longer an amenity when it's an eyesore. When you live in St. Pete downtown right now, Are you going to actually be able to sell your house when it smells like, someone left a refrigerator, unplugged for a couple of days? And that's a reality that they're experiencing in the River Lagoon. So property values do not hold up when the water quality degrades. And we've known that from studies that have been done mostly in lakes, but people pay more dollar per square foot to live next to a clear lake than a lake that's not even that clear. There's 20,000 jobs that are associated with bay-related activities, commercial fishermen in Cortez, but also recreational fishing guides. I have 2 of them on my street. I live right across the bridge right here. And also the people who are bartenders and waiters and waitresses and restaurant owners and folks who rent out jet skis. 20,000 jobs associated with bay-related activities in Sarasota Bay. So, but there's other reasons, and so I wanted to throw this photo up because this kind of tells you like what's at risk, and a lot of it is our Florida wildlife heritage. So on the left is, for those, we talk about seagrass, and sometimes I'm not sure everyone knows what we talk about when we mean seagrass. This isn't the stuff that grows in sand dunes. This is plants that grow underwater that need light, and if you cloud the water clarity, they don't grow so well. So on the left is like a healthy manatee and beautiful grass bed. On the right is manatees right now in the River Lagoon. This was taken earlier this year. And do you notice the difference between them? Because when I first saw the one on the right, I didn't even know it was a manatee. I thought it was like a seal or something like that. They have this kind of peanut head shape to them. Ed referred to it earlier. So far in the first 6 months of this year, we've lost more than 800 manatees. That's more than any other year. That's more than 10% of the population that we had the last time we did an estimate. And the epicenter of their loss is the Indian River Lagoon. And the main reason why we're losing them is because they're starving to death. And they're starving to death because they're starving to death because their habitat has shrunk so much. They've lost 60% of their seagrass, and a 1,000-pound manatee needs about 100 pounds of seagrass a day. And the remaining 40% is so thin that their total food that's available is down 95%. So they're starving to death. And I was thinking about stopping there, but I actually think it's important to know what happens when a manatee starves to death. And what they do is they drown. Because they lose their body fat, they are lower in the water column because they don't have the buoyancy. So it's harder for them to come up to the surface. They're mammals that breathe air. They're descendant from elephants from 50 million years ago. And when their body mass starts to lose, their organs shift around, and their diaphragm breaks loose, and part of their lower organs shift up and collapses part of their lungs, so they swim sideways. So starving manatees swim sideways. They swim lower in the water column. They don't have enough energy. So a lot of them starve to death, drown. And the ones that, I don't know if manatees panic, but what they'll do, because they are having a harder time breathing, is they'll beach themselves. And they'll be basically in shallow waters so that they'll be able to breathe so they won't drown by sinking below the bottom. And what that does is that exposes them to cold stress because they can't handle water temperature lower than 68. So it doesn't have to be a very cold day to kill a manatee. So when you hear cold stress, well, that cold stress might have been induced by them beaching themselves because they're afraid of basically drowning. The other way that manatees die with red tide, for example, is the toxins from the red tide settle out on the grass beds, and they last longer than the red tide organism. And so they can actually ingest red tide toxins, brevetoxin, on the seagrass meadows, or they can actually, by swimming through a red tide, they can inhale it. And when they inhale enough of this toxin load, it paralyzes them, and so they drown by not being able to swim. So they just sink down below the surface. Even if they're otherwise healthy, they just become paralyzed and drown. So that's what's going on in our state right now. So what we're going to talk about in Sarasota Bay and Tampa Bay is really important because we do not want our systems to look like the Indian River Lagoon. And it happened quickly in that system, and it may not be recoverable. I put myself through graduate school as a commercial fisherman on the East Coast. That fishery is gone. I studied a seagrass meadow for my master's degree over there, and that seagrass meadow is gone. Indian River Lagoon, if you know how it existed 20, 30 years ago, it doesn't exist that way anymore. It's a very different system. We do not want that to happen in our waters. So how do we prevent that? So our key here is nutrient management, just like in Tampa Bay. And so we're going to talk about what's the health of Sarasota Bay, because that's the question I always get asked. And the answer is, it depends on what time and what location, because it's a different story. It's not one story across Sarasota Bay. So the state of Florida requires us to measure the water column and only the water column to determine the health of the bay. But there's a lot more to the health of the bay than just the water column. And so we go beyond that, just like the Tampa Bay Estuary Program does. So this cartoon is meant to show what happens when you load a system with nutrients. And on the far left would be something that Sarasota Bay won't be and never was, which is like maybe the dry Tortugas, Fort Jefferson, you know, where you have corals, for example. That's not what Sarasota Bay should be, and that's not what we're trying to make it. But on the far right is the Indian River Lagoon, and we don't want it to get that way either. So as you add nutrients to the system, you get phytoplankton, which is the kind of green microscopic. That's what makes the water green. But you get other types of algae, the kind of tumbleweed algae that are found in our system as well. You get algae that grow on top of the seagrass, and sometimes it's a mixture of those guys. So all of these things are kind of like able to be quantified when we ask, what is the health of the bay? And so we developed a report card. And the important things are, we're like the Tampa Estuary Program. We're not regulatory. We don't have permits. We don't write permits. There's plenty of regulatory guidance, but a lot of it's ignored. And so what we're trying to do is to provide guidance that is understandable by the public and actionable, because we already have, every part of Sarasota Bay is already impaired for bacteria or oxygen or nutrients, but it hasn't really triggered what we need to be doing. And I think part of it is we need to make sure the public and our elected officials are on the same page about the magnitude of the problem and what needs to be done to address it. So that's really our goal, is to communicate to the public and to policymakers what needs to be done. It's also meant to be, you know, scientifically sound, because that's where we drive from. We don't like, we may be emotional, but we're emotional based upon science, okay? So we want things to happen, but we're not just making up stuff, all right? So our report card has been vetted by, you know, dozens of scientists with literally centuries of experience working in Sarasota Bay. I've been working in Sarasota Bay for 30 years. I've been working in Tampa Bay for 35 years. And I still need to have my ideas vetted through a larger body of evidence. So this isn't my opinion. This is the opinion of the estuary program, as vetted through our policy board. So we've actually, when we give you this report card, it has been vetted through our policy board as well. So the elements are, our report card is trying to get us back to a condition that existed only about a decade ago. So we're not trying to get back to Sarasota Bay what it was 100 years ago, because we don't know what it was like 100 years ago. We're not trying to get to what it was like 50 years ago, because we don't know what it was 50 years ago. Tampa Bay has this photography set that shows how deep seagrass beds grew in the 1940s, and it allows them to say, aha, seagrass beds grew to 7 feet. I want to do that, right? We actually can't do that, because our grass beds grow deeper than that, and our photography that's back from that time didn't capture, you know, what happens down in 10 to 12 feet, and that's important. So we don't know what happened back then. We don't know exactly what was going on, but we do know that about a decade ago, 2006, 2012, we had a healthier bay. During that time period, we had about a 28% increase in seagrass coverage. That only happens when you're healthy. So we had increased seagrass. We had lower levels of nitrogen. Nitrogen is a great way to make your lawn green. It's a great way to make your citrus tree grow faster. It's a great way to make algae grow faster. So if you don't want algae to grow faster, keep the nitrogen out of your waters. So we have lower levels of nitrogen. We had lower levels of macroalgae. We had lower levels of phytoplankton. So the water was clearer, there was less macroalgae, there was less nitrogen, and we had a period of increasing seagrass. And that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to take every year that we've got and compare it to how does it compare to that earlier time when this was a healthier bay. So I'm going to run you through a little bit of arithmetic, all right? So the way we do that is to take all the data that we've got, chlorophyll and nitrogen, TN stands for total nitrogen, and we collect it from all the sites in, like, say, Palmasola Bay in 2019, and we calculate the average, and we compare it to that reference period. And if Palmasola Bay in 2019 had a value that was below the reference period mean, that's good, so we give it a score of 4. If it was above that reference period mean, but it was within a standard deviation, and standard deviation higher is like 15%, so it's not that bad. If it's higher than that, but within a standard deviation, then we give it a 3, because it's high, but it's not that bad. And it's within the range of what you had in that reference period. If it's outside the reference period standard deviation, then we give it a 2. And if it's higher than the worst value in a reference period, we give it a 1, because that means that water quality is worse than the worst year during that healthier time period. Seagrass is the opposite. A big number for seagrass is a good thing. So if you have more seagrass than the mean during that reference period, you get a 4. If you have less, but it's within, you know, kind of like plus or minus 15%, then we give you a 3. If it's outside of standard deviation, you get a 2. But if it's lower than the worst year, then you get a 1. And because that means that you've got less seagrass than the worst year, not the average, but the worst year when it was a healthier system. And then macroalgae, which is something we've been quantifying since 2006. We have no idea how much macroalgae was out here in 1950, but we do know how much is out there since 2006 onwards. And we use these categories at Sarasota County. If it's easy to find it, then it's a 1. If it's kind of rare, then we give it a 4. So it includes everything in here but the fish. So our report card of the Health of the Bay, if we can figure out a way to put fish in there, we will, but we haven't figured out a way to do the fish yet because we want to have it for every part of the bay. But it's everything that makes a healthy Sarasota Bay is in here except the fish. So what do you do with the scores? Because this is the other part that our management committee said is like, you got to tell people what it means. So we color code it first off because it's easier for me to like understand what's happening with color codes because I'm really kind of simple. So if it's blue, that's like offshore Gulf of Mexico. If it's red, it means stop. You're doing something wrong. So if your score is 3.5 or higher for a year, for a segment, then that means you have more 4s than anything else, which means you're doing pretty good. You're more like the reference period. If your scores are less than 1.5, that means you have more 1s than anything else, and that means you are right now in that bay worse than the worst year in the reference period, and you're not going to be able to be the reference period if everything is worse than the reference period, the worst year in the reference period. And so what we mean is you kind of fall into this range of responses, and blues and greens are probably pretty good. But if you start getting yellows and reds, that means, you know, hold on, something's going wrong with your system. And so what should you do? Like in yellows, if you start getting yellows, that means pay attention to permits. It makes no sense to spend dollars on public education, outreach, stormwater retrofits, and people putting oysters out in the bay if 2 miles down the road someone's not abiding by their permit for their wastewater treatment plant. That's a waste of money. That's not, you know, governmental oversight. That's a waste of money if someone isn't playing by the rules. So, you know, here's an indication. Someone might be a problem is if you start getting more yellows and reds. But there could be other phenomena happening as well. So here are our bay segments. And 3 parts of lower Sarasota Bay because they all have separate, you know, kind of watersheds. And then the upper part of Sarasota Bay is very similar north to south. And then Palmasola Bay is kind of a pullout because Palmasola Bay is very different from every other part of Sarasota Bay. So there's good news and bad news in here. First off, look at 2006 to 2012, and you'll see lots of blues and greens because it was a healthier system. And it was without, you know, across all of our bay, it was a healthy system. It wasn't one part that was driving it to be healthy. It was all parts that were driving it to be healthy. We were a healthier system just about a decade ago. If you're in Palmasola Bay, you're still a healthy system. Palmasola Bay is still blues and greens, okay? The upper part of the bay was doing good until 2017, 2018, and when it dips to yellow. And there were 2 red tides. There wasn't 1 red tide. There were 2 red tides in the upper part of the bay. There was 2016 going into 2017. Then we had Hurricane Irma in 2017. And then we had the 2018 going into 2019 red tide. So we had 2 distinct red tide events, not 1, in the upper part of that bay. And what that did is it changed our water clarity big time. And when it's very dark and the water is very warm, that's very bad for seagrass. So one of the things that may be on the future for Tampa Bay is seagrass loss associated with the red tide, because as you'll see later, that's exactly what happened in Sarasota Bay. We lost seagrass because of red tide because it was so intense in that system. And the language we use is humans don't cause red tide, but we can cause it to be worse. That's not scientifically, you know, controversial at all. That is actually well documented now. So don't make red tide worse because you can't stop it, but you can stop it from being worse. That's the kind of message we have. And the red tide that hit the upper part of the bay, you'll see in just a few slides, created a big impact that maybe we're going to see in Tampa Bay as well. But in the lower part of the bay, we've had problems for years, and they date back to 2013. And you can't blame the problems in the lower part of the bay on red tide because, yeah, maybe it got worse in Little Sarasota Bay in 2018, but it was already trending in the wrong direction for years. And we'll talk about how that happened. And actually, there's also some good news in there because look at Roberts Bay. It was yellow, and in the last 2 years, it's been green. So we can start to see improvements in systems if we start doing the right thing. And now we're going to talk about how you do the right thing. So seagrass is a biological indicator. We peaked in 2016. We're down 22% from that. Indian River Lagoon was down 60%. And we don't want to go much lower than this. We may continue to go down a little bit more, but if you start getting into that 60% decline, remember, it's not just the acreage. The remaining grass beds are much thinner. That's when you bring about the starving manatee situation, when the overall food is missing because the amount is gone and the density of the remaining grass beds has been reduced. But this isn't good, but it's not too scary because there's something else in there, which is we're still better than we were in the 1980s. So we still have the ability to recover again because we haven't gotten that bad yet. But this is not a good trajectory to be on. The patterns that we see of the seagrass loss is different in different parts of the bay. So the upper part of the bay, note first off, the y-axis, the one that goes up and down, is different because there's a lot more seagrass in the upper part of the bay than the lower part of the bay. But in the upper part of the bay, we lost about 2,000 acres, and we'll show you where in a minute, between 2018 and 2020. But I'm semi-optimistic because if it's due to red tide, which we think it was, and we don't have another huge red tide, it's not a very polluted part of the bay. And if we get our act together, it can come back. Why do I think so? Because it did it before, between 2006 and 2008. So the seagrass loss that occurred is in waters deeper than 6 feet. They're kind of an area that you don't get a lot of seagrass in most parts of Tampa Bay, but it's a kind of a prime habitat for us. It's also an area that recovered in the past. So if we get our water quality back to what it was, we probably should be able to get it back. In the lower part of the bay, we had a 30% increase from 1988 to 2014, and then we lost all of it. And we lost basically 25 years of progress, and it started in 2014. Can't blame that on the red tide. The good news in the lower bay is 2018 to 2020, the last 2 points there, there's no further decline. So the upper part of the bay loses seagrass because of red tide. The lower part of the bay plateaus out because something else is going on. It's not red tide related. It's a different phenomenon that was happening earlier. Because if you remember, the yellow started in 2013 in the lower part of the bay. So something was going on. So what was it? That's the cool part. This is the detective part. So the big losses that we have, if you're familiar with Sarasota Bay, the big losses were concentrated around Long Bar Point, to the north and to the south. It's 2,000 acres. This is where the red tide got up to 1 million cells, and that makes it very dark. It's very dark water when it's very warm water, and that's a bad thing for seagrass because they need sunlight to photosynthesize, and the water temperature goes up, they have to respire. So they go into negative oxygen balance, they die. So that's habitat for maybe about 30 million fish. So there's fish that live in bare sand, but there's a lot more fish that live when there's seagrass. And if we take the difference between bare sand and seagrass and we extrapolate it over 2,000 acres, that's 30 million fish that no longer are living in Sarasota Bay because of that seagrass loss. And that is important because this is also, the recreational fishing guides tell me, this is kind of like a sea trout spawning hotspot, if you would. So that will have effects on our fish populations moving forward. So the more specific thing, the reason why you have an NEP is we're supposed to not just stop with report cards. We're supposed to tell people what you need to do, and what you need to do differs upon where you are. So one of the things that we can do is we have a great data set, again, almost entirely funded by local governments, that allows us to figure out what is it that I should do to change this bad condition I'm in. And so let's look at it. We start in a bay. And then we start looking in the tributaries, the watersheds, and we start to find what is it that's happening that we can actually act upon. So this is Roberts Bay. This is nitrogen. This is how much data we have in our system. It's an incredibly data-rich system. So Roberts Bay, south of Siesta Key Drive, shows nitrogen concentrations. And if you see that value of 200, we used to go below that, not every year. We haven't been below that in 10 years. On the right-hand side, AGM stands for annual geometric mean. It's like an average, but it's a little bit different. And the green box represents the last couple of years where we were exhibiting these problems. The red horizontal line represents the highest nitrogen value we had in the prior 15 years. And what you can see is in the green box, 5 of the last 7 years, we've had a nitrogen concentration higher than the worst year of the prior 15. So we've changed the nutrient availability in that system over the last 7 years, that the majority of those years have had more nitrogen than the worst year. Not on average, but the worst year of the prior 15. So we've got a pulse of nitrogen that's been in our system. But there's some good news in here as well. See, come up optimistic. So what is the good news? Look at the last couple of years. They're not continuing to go up, all right? They're kind of going down. So what we need to find out is what the heck could have loaded nutrients into our system that maybe it's going down a little bit. Because you can't say, oh, it's all the new development. It's going down a little bit. And we're not like taking development out. So something happened in this system. So if we look at this is Philippi Creek at Tam Trail, US 41. This is the nitrogen. Again, this is county data. So I see Rob Brown in there for Manatee County and Charlie Hunsicker. You know, these folks have been supporting this long-term monitoring program. They need a shout out because managing the bay is more than ribbon cutting events. It's kind of like the non-sexy month after month stuff that's going on here. So this is nitrogen, and the red line represents the mathematical equation that best explains what's going on. And you can see it's not just going up. It went up and then it's coming down. And you can see that in raw data, and then mathematically you can kind of see the curve. So what was going on that brought more nitrogen and then allowed the nitrogen to go down? And that's the yellow box. The yellow box represents the years during which we had unallowable under their permit discharges from a non-AWT plant in Sarasota County. And AWT means Advanced Wastewater Treatment. City of Tampa's nitrogen concentration is 90% lower than it was in the 1970s. Because they went to a technology that removes nitrogen. City of Bradenton has the same thing. City of Palmetto has the same thing. City of Sarasota has the same thing. Manatee County and Sarasota County don't have that. And that doesn't mean you have to be at AWT, but it means you have to be more careful because non-AWT effluent has a lot higher nitrogen concentration, like 10 times as much. And if you appropriately store it and dispose of it and you don't over-apply it, it's not a problem. But we had 750 million gallons leak out into our watershed over several years. And those several years are shown in the yellow. And when those leaks were detected, and frankly, they were detected by folks in this room, not with the government, but with an agency, thank you, Justin and friends, those were stopped because of a consent decree. And the stopping of those discharges results in a reduction in nitrogen. And that's the kind of good news. So remember, the seagrass loss we had there leveled off. And it leveled off because the nitrogen concentrations have been going down, and the nitrogen concentrations were going down because now they're abiding by their permit again. So that's what I mean. I'm not talking about overregulation. I mean like play by the rules. When you have a nutrient load of 200 million gallons that came out from Piney Point, that's going to set us back for decades potentially. And this release of 750 million gallons set us back for about 20 years of recovery. So it does matter, and we do need regulatory oversight to be appropriate. So I would end there except Piney Point. And so the things about Piney Point to keep in mind is when you hear 200 million gallons, that's a lot, right? But keep in mind also what that concentration was. That was the equivalent of 80,000 bags of fertilizer dumped into the bay in 10 days. Roughly 80,000, something like that? Maybe it was a little bit more. Yeah, it depends on the bag of fertilizer too. So, but it was 230 milligrams per liter. The worst performing wastewater treatment plant in our watershed is 18 milligrams per liter. The city of Sarasota is 1.6. So it was a concentration that was more than 100 times higher than what comes out of the city of Sarasota. It was 10 times higher, more concentrated than what comes out of the worst performing wastewater treatment plant in our watershed. And it is a form of nitrogen that is the absolute worst form that you can have for an algal bloom. The nitrogen that comes from the air is 1 milligram per liter, roughly. The nitrogen that comes out of the river has a lot of like sticks and leaves and organic stuff that's not necessarily going to trigger an algal bloom. This is ammonia, and it is 100% the preferred form of nitrogen for an algal bloom. And it came in at a concentration 10 times higher than the worst performing wastewater treatment plant. So if you turn it into wastewater discharges from our worst plant, it's more like you added 2 billion gallons in 10 days. So when people say, well, I'm not sure it was that big of a deal, it was localized, didn't last that long, they don't know what they're talking about. This was possibly the worst thing that we've experienced in decades. And we understand it had to happen, all right? But we're just telling people, we want you to understand just how big of an impact it has. And it's not something that's going to be easy for us to get beyond. So notice right here that blue, that kind of graphic, this is from the earlier part, this is May, comes down into the Manatee River and Sarasota Bay and Miguel Bay and Palmasola Bay and Anna Maria Sound. So it absolutely does come into Sarasota Bay. I've been told that there's no connection. People don't know what they're talking about. So, but the other thing is that color there is kind of like a blue-green, right? And that represents a 1,000-fold dilution. So that's supposed to make us feel better. 1,000-fold dilution, big deal. Well, It's 230 milligrams per liter when it came in. So a 1,000-fold dilution is 0.2. Our background this time of year is 0.4. So if you add a 1,000-fold dilution of Piney Point to our waters, you've just increased the concentration 50%, which is enough to give us an algal bloom. So everything touched by that is enough to cause an algal bloom. It may be a 1,000-fold dilution, but it's a 1,000-fold dilution of something 10 times more concentrated than the worst wastewater treatment plant in our watershed. So keep that in mind. So what did we have? This is the fun day to be a marine biologist, jumping into the water in this location. So we're not just dipping water samples, we go to the bottom of the bay. Actually, I did it. I didn't want my staff to do it. So that white, you know what? I've had the kids. I don't need any more. So the white little buoy there represents Station 0. So we go down the bottom of the bay there, and we look at what's the health of the bay. You know, is the grass, how much macroalgae is there, and everything like that. And on the back far there, that's like a mangrove fringe. And in between the two, that's not a mudflat. That's Lingvia algae. This has got a common name of snot grass, mermaid hair, or fireweed. And it's called fireweed because it causes contact dermatitis, and it makes your skin feel like you've been rolling around in attic insulation or something. And it can kill a horse if it eats it. It can kill a dog if it eats it. So if it washed up onto your yard, keep it away from your pets. But when it decomposes, the picture on the right, it's decomposed by bacteria that'll use up all the oxygen in a water column. And if you've been around it, and it was really big on Sneed Island and Manatee River, it doesn't just smell like rotten eggs, it smells like a decomposing steak, because that's the protein breaking down. So it smells like someone literally unplugged a refrigerator for a couple of days and then popped it open in the middle of your house. And when that stuff decomposes, if you're a big fish, you just swim away. But if you're a small fish or a crab or a worm that lives in the bottom or something that a little fish eats, you're just dead because there's no oxygen in that system. And that's what we had all over the place in May. This is from Anna Maria Sound in May. And it's actually from growing on the bottom of the bay. And this is what people have not been sampling. So when you talk about water quality standards and the stuff that Ed showed, it's fantastic, but it wasn't showing this. So we started a monitoring program with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. We worked for a couple months in Tampa Bay. Thank you to the policy board for letting us do that. To understand what was happening and the Lingvia problem that we had. So this is an underwater photo, and you see those little circles there? That's oxygen bubbles that take that plant and lift it up off the bottom, and it gets up onto the surface. When you see it on the surface, it's pretty much in the last stages, so it's kind of dying. And then it just goes wherever the wind blows it, and then it decomposes in place. But it's formed in the bottom of the bay, entangled upon the seagrass beds, which means it's reducing light to these guys. And if it lasts too long, it's going to be a real problem. It affected more the ecology of the bay. We rent boats out when we go out in the field because we don't have our own boat. And what we found is that people are telling us the boats are available on short term because they can't give the boat away. No one wants to go out in the bay because someone comes down from Ohio, they look at that, and they think this is sewage. It smells like sewage, looks like sewage. They're not going to let their kid go in the bay. And that absolutely affected people's livelihoods when this stuff was in Anna Maria Sound in particular. And who wants to sit out in like a waterfront restaurant when it actually looks like this and smells the way it did? And if you're from around here, Sneed Island, you know what it smelled like during May and June. So is there a link between what we saw and Piney Point? Yeah, for 3 reasons. Number one, we've always had Lingvia, we've always had red tide, but as bad as it was, I've worked in this system 30 years, I've never seen it like that. I've talked to people who lived on Holmes Beach for 50 years, and they've never seen anything like that. The location of the worst Lingvia bloom was where the plume was. And all the problem areas we have with all the other things, we didn't have it. So it's bad where the plume was, it's not bad where the plume wasn't. That makes sense. Number two, the nutrient mass. Pound of nitrogen can get you about 300 pounds of algae. So keep that in mind when you start talking about nutrient loads. 200 tons of nitrogen gets you a lot more than 200 tons of algae because it's about 1 to 300 ratio. So it didn't take a lot of nitrogen to give us all that Lingvia, and the amount of nitrogen that would be required to give us that Lingvia is much less than the amount of nitrogen that was loaded. So, you know, what Ed just told you, about 40–50% of the mass is still in the bay. Just a portion of that loaded nitrogen was enough to cause the problems that we saw in Anna Maria Sound. And then lastly, because some folks will say like, well, there's 2 months, there's 2 months between the load and the expression of the Lingvia. That doesn't make sense. It does make sense. That's exactly what was found in the best studied system I know, which is Roebuck Bay, Australia. They load the nitrogen, the water gets warmer, the water's fairly clear, and then you get the Lingvia explosion about 2 months later. That's kind of exactly what happened in our waters right here. So the nutrients are cycling through our system. If you look at the picture on the left, that was the gross place that we were at in early June. 2 weeks later, looks pretty good, right? But it doesn't look really good, because look at the color of that water. That's June. That water is green as can be. And that's not what our water is supposed to look like at the end of the dry season before the beginning of the rainy season kicks in. Our water should be blue. It should be clear. It should be pretty. It shouldn't look like that. That water is green. And that's what recreational fishing guides and people who spend a lot of time on the water know. That water was not healthy looking, even with the Lingvia gone. And we can show that scientifically as well. You saw an earlier version of the right-hand picture from Ed. If it's got a circle around it, that means it's a chlorophyll value, which is a measure of phytoplankton in the water, that's higher than we would see, more than 1 standard deviation above what we would normally see for that time of the year. So our water is greener than it should be beginning this wet season. And that's what the graphic on the left shows too. The graphic on the left is modeled chlorophyll versus nitrogen loads in our system. And this is both great products by Tampa SJ program, in particular Marcus Beck. The guy is brilliant. And so what you see is the years are color-coded from red to blue, so hotter colors to warmer colors. And if you look at the graph, you can see that the latter years, the cooler years, are lower values. And what that means is we have been doing a better job of managing our chlorophyll. Our water has been getting cleaner, but that purple line all the way to the left, that's 2021. So we are out of range of what we are expecting to have. So it's not like a massive, the water is greener than anyone's ever seen on the planet. It means we're starting off this wet season with more algae in the water than we typically end a wet season. So what is it going to be at the end of this wet season? And we just don't know. We have no idea exactly what's going to happen in the next couple of months. But we do know that it always makes sense to do the right thing to keep algae growth under control. So this is a shot from Sarasota Bay middle of this week, and it shows red tide in Sarasota Bay. Sarasota Bay has red tide. It's been off our coast, now it's in our bay. We have dead fish in Sarasota Bay right now. It's not nearly as bad as Tampa Bay, not nearly as bad. But notice the difference. That red tide, it's kind of like patchy, it's not really that evident, and it's surrounded by blue water. Right? Because if you bring a red tide into our waters from offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and the water is as green and as nutrient rich as Tampa Bay was, you can expect it to explode. Piney Point didn't cause that red tide, it caused it to be worse. And if the water brings in a mass of red tide and the surrounding water is blue and it's nutrient poor, it's not going to take off, hopefully, to the same degree that it would if you loaded that system with 200 tons of nitrogen. So this is the key. If you want to keep red tide away and it'll never be here, it's not going to happen. But if you want to keep red tide from being as bad as it could be, we can do that. So how do we do that? We get back to what we used to do, and that is nutrient reductions. We've been doing this. We know how to do this. Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay are still cleaner than they were 20, 30 years ago. Okay. Tampa Bay, we're not quite sure exactly what's going to happen. But we do know that we're better off by having a healthier bay than what we're facing right now. But there was a 57% nitrogen load reduction in Tampa Bay from the 70s to the 90s. We had about a 50% reduction that occurred in 2 years. Manatee County made big improvements to their wastewater treatment around the Southwest Regional Treatment Plant, discharges that used to happen. City of Sarasota went to AWT, and we have a much better bay. The water quality got better in both systems, and across our systems, we had more seagrass recovery. It's not just Tampa Bay, it's not just Sarasota Bay, it's also St. Joseph Sound and Clearwater Harbor and Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbor. They were all doing better because one of the things we have is we have a state law about wastewater. It's called the Grizzle-Fig Act, which dates from 1987. It actually replaces the Wilson-Grizzle Act, which from 1972, I think. So 1972, there was a dictate. You cannot discharge wastewater to surface waters unless it has less than 3 milligrams per liter nitrogen. And it's a state law that's geographically restricted to our area. So they don't have this in Miami. They don't have it in Pensacola Bay. They don't have it in Indian River Lagoon. We have the best wastewater regulation in the state of Florida, and it was because of local legislators. It had to be a state law because you have a state permit, but it's geographically restricted. This area deserves to have the recovery that we used to have because we've always made preserving water quality a priority, dating back 50 years. So all of those systems have more seagrass than they had 20 years ago. That's what the line is meant to represent. 100 represents how much seagrass did you have in 1999, and every system was better. Tampa Bay had 70% increase in seagrass coverage over that time period. The increase was big because the loss was big. But even in Sarasota Bay, which is the yellow line, we had a 40% increase over that time period. So we know how to manage our system. We just need to get back to it. So last slide, I think. So the potential actions. First off, get those dead fish out of the system. There is a nutrient benefit to every fish that you get out of this system. 600 tons of fish represents about 4 tons of nitrogen. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean every fish, but these mass accumulations of fish in your canals, get them out of there. Because when that fish sinks to the bottom of the canal, it's going to decompose, it's going to use up all the oxygen, it's going to make that canal worse, and that's a nitrogen load you could get out of there. And the nitrogen removal efficiency is actually better than a typical wet detention pond from some numbers that we've been looking at as well. So it does make sense. Try to get NPDES credit for it, honestly, and try to get reimbursed for it. Save your receipts. Also, support various, restoration-led activities, and that is, we may need to do things that we never did before. We may need to transplant seagrasses. We never did it before. That seagrass increase, 40 square miles, that's 2 Manhattans. We didn't transplant it. It came back on its own when we got the water quality right again. But maybe we need to jumpstart it. I don't know. We have to think outside the box. Intermediate term, you've heard it before, shut down Piney Point. We can't handle this happening again. And this is the 3rd time in 20 years, so we just can't handle this happening again. It's too much at risk. We've spent $500 million fixing up Sarasota Bay, and the amount of money that's on the horizon to be spent, Sarasota County is going to spend at least $150 million to upgrade Bee Ridge Wastewater Treatment Plant, and they've publicly discussed spending $500 million to upgrade every single plant to AWT. Longboat Key is looking at spending $20 million to replace the pipeline from Longboat Key to the mainland, which they need to do because they had a break in 2019. It was in the mangroves. If it was in the middle of the bay, it could have been a nightmare. Manatee County just spent $24 million upgrading their wastewater treatment system. So people are spending right there. You've got close to $1 billion or more spent or being spent on maintaining our water quality. And we can't afford to be set back by something that actually should not happen according to their permit, which gets to the other point, which is, adequacy of regulatory oversight. I don't think anyone's a fan of regulatory oversight. You ever try to get a permit to put a lift on a dock? That's what I'm doing. It's a nightmare. But nonetheless, if you spend in huge amounts of money on restoration and then it's offset by 2 miles down the road, someone not meeting their permit, that's not a good waste. That's a waste of money. So we need to make sure people abide by their permits. For 5 years, we had that problem in the Bee Ridge plant, and there was basically no action. I mean, I can understand 10 days. I can't understand 5 years. Why did that happen for 5 years? We need to make sure that our regulatory oversight is commensurate with the impact of that particular stressor. And then other things. Ed touched on it earlier. This isn't going to be easy, but it's never going to be easier because our waters are getting warmer and our air temperature is getting warmer as well. And that's important for growing algae the same way it's important for growing corn in Iowa. A farmer doesn't want to plant his corn too early because cold snap can cause a loss of his crop. Well, guess what? Algae responds the same way. If it's no longer getting that cold, then they can grow longer. We have a great data set for air temperature in Bradenton, and we haven't had a freezing temperature in 10 years. We used to have freezing temperatures, not necessarily every year, but we used to have them a lot. We haven't had a freezing temperature in Bradenton in about 10 years. That means our air is getting warmer and our water is definitely getting warmer. We also have sea level rise, and that actually is important for bay restoration. It's not a huge number, it's not a scary number, but like over the last 100 years, the average sea level rise has been about 1 inch a decade. Over the last 20 years, it's been 3 inches a decade. That's not a model, that's actual data. Anyone can find it, St. Pete. It's expected to double again, which means over the next 30 years, expect 18 inches. That's what the town of Longboat Key is doing. They're planning on 18 inches of additional sea level rise, just like Connecticut, 20 by 2050. And what that means is if I want to protect that seagrass meadow, I need to protect its offshore edge. And if it grows to 6 feet of water depth, in 30 years, it's going to be 7.5 feet. So the water's going to have to be clearer. Otherwise, it's going to retreat. So it's going to be more challenging to deal with warmer temperatures and sea level rise, but we've done it in the past because we have already experienced sea level rise, and we were doing a pretty good job until fairly recently about this. So if there's any kind of community that can do this, it's this one. And that's why I would just kind of like suggest, it's kind of depressing, but it's also kind of like a new challenge, and we've done it before. Our bays are not in great shape right now, but they're still healthier than they were in the 1970s and 1980s. And look at the recovery we brought about back then. We just have to do it again. And for a changing, warming climate, you're going to be more resilient if you're healthier. So if we become the Indian River Lagoon, do you think a healthy Sarasota Bay is better going to handle what happens in the next 30 years or the Indian River Lagoon? Does anyone think the Indian River Lagoon is going to be able to handle warmer temperatures and sea level rise? I don't think so. But we can if we get to work. And I agree with Ed, 2 to 5 years. We don't have a whole lot more time to actually get our act together, I think. And I think that's it. If you have any questions, we're very formal. Dave@sarasotobay.org.
Thank you, Dave. Wow, a lot of information, and thank you for paying attention. I'd like to recognize the elected officials briefly. I know we have Kevin Van Ostenbridge in the back there. He represents the Island District, West Manatee County Commissioner. You have Misty Servia, who's down South County. Good morning. Carol Whitmore's here. We have Reggie Bellamy here. And Reggie, thank you for coming. And we have Scott Hopes, the county administrator, that's here. Well, I appreciate your attendance as well. We have Mayor Brown, Gene Brown from the city of Bradenton. Thank you. He wasn't going to make it because he's dealing with the budget, so that's how important this was, that he took the time out of his schedule, and we appreciate that. He also served on the estuary board down in Sarasota for a little bit. Who else am I missing? George Cruz. I'm sorry, George. Where are you at? There you are. You're hiding behind the camera there. Good morning. Any other elected officials there that failed to recognize? I just want to say thank you for coming. I mean, it's a huge opportunity to get educated on these issues from the scientists, and we'll take some questions right now. One of the questions was just this real basic question on red tide. What does it do to marine life? I think you touched on it as far as with the manatee, but if you want to address the question, I think Ed, if you want to address that one.
Yeah, there's 2 potential issues when we do have red tides. It does produce a toxin called brevetoxin, and that in and of itself can be deadly to fish and other marine life, and it also causes problems for any shellfish. And, it accumulates in shellfish, preventing harvest and subsequently eating of those shellfish. And then when we do see this huge amount of algal biomass and production in the water column, and that algal biomass dies and decomposes, like Dave described with the Lingvia, that creates another harmful impact to the ecosystem in terms of depressing the oxygen levels in the water column, and again, that could cause additional fish kills. So we're actually able to see these quite clearly with a continuous monitoring station offshore of Port Manatee. We saw a huge spike in oxygen. That was all the red tide that was in the bay in early July, and we're now actually seeing a crash of the oxygen, and it's being continuously monitored just offshore. And as I mentioned, those cycles of booms and busts of algae are problematic because of the toxins they produce, and then the cycles of dissolved oxygen that's consumed by the bacteria that's decomposing not only the algae but the dead sea life that remains in the wake of that toxin-producing algae.
Thanks, Ed. Stay up there. Thanks. One of the observations is that we didn't have red tide in the parts of the Tampa Bay east of the Skyway in 2018 for the most part. I think that was pretty it was spared from the impacts of red tide. So this time it seems like it's the epicenter, and there's a lot of questions, and I think it was answered in the presentations. Did Piney Point really flare up this red tide event? I think both you and Dave have indicated that red tide's always around. So, how how did Piney Point really impact our red tide situation today, in your scientific opinion?
Yeah, there's both the availability of nutrients and the physical conditions in the bay at the start of this year that were atypical. And certainly the amount of nutrients, as Dave and I explained, in the system at the start of when red tide entered lower Tampa Bay was significant. So, observations of red tide do not typically go much further past the city of St. Petersburg in prior events. The 2018 event, the red tide was centered in and along the beaches, didn't go much further up into the bay, past the Skyway, as Joe mentioned. So we have not seen concentrations of red tide in Tampa Bay like this year since 1971. That was the last time we've seen red tide concentrations up into Old Tampa Bay, up into Hillsborough Bay, in the Tampa Bay system. So this is an atypical year in terms of how red tide has responded in the bay proper. And that's disconcerting because, that's creating a large fish kill mass within the bay, and it's just washing back and forth at this point due to the tides and winds. So this is not a normal year by any stretch of the imagination.
So in summary, there is a nexus, in your opinion, for Piney Point and the red tide event that we're experiencing?
Loading the system with 200 tons of nitrogen at a time of year when we don't have other nutrient sources, yeah, definitely exasperates the situation and expression of red tide that we're seeing in Tampa Bay.
Dave?
Yeah, I can build on that. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Whichever one you want. I'll give up my mic.
So one of the things is we're probably, when you talk about nutrient masses and everything like that, imagine you got two kiddie pools, all right, and they're filled with water, and you're going to add a pound of nitrogen to both of them. And one of them is going to be what comes out of the Little Manatee River. So most of that nitrogen, it's the same amount, you got a pound. But it's going to be like organic. It's going to be like tannins, dissolved substances, insect wings, all that sort of stuff. That nitrogen is not going to be immediately available for an algal cell to take it up and become another algal cell, because it's a little bit more what we call refractory. Now imagine you're going to add a pound, but it's going to be liquid fertilizer. It's all going to be ammonia or nitrate. That's going to be immediately available. So not only was this 200 tons, it was 200 tons of the most biologically active form of nitrogen. So it's a very different nitrogen load than what comes out of our rivers. It's a very different load than what comes out of the sky. It's a high concentration in a short period of time of the most volatile nitrogen load that you can have. So we're really underestimating its importance when we compare it to nutrient loads and nutrient concentrations. It was the worst type of nitrogen load that you could bring during a time period where the water was clearer and getting warmer and it was salty. So it was really all these things. So we're really working with, one of the reasons why it's hard for us to predict what's happening is because we've never had a load like this delivered this magnitude. So just keep that in mind. Not all nitrogen loads are the same. This was the worst type of nitrogen load.
There's a question here. Have you seen any effects on bird mortality related to red tide and Lingvia?
Not that I've heard, but we suspect that we might start seeing additional impacts to anything feeding on the dead fish, because the toxins will accumulate in the dead fish, and there's propensity for some of the birds to feed on floating dead fish.
Just to follow up, there have been dead fish before they floated up on St. Pete. So 4th of July, that bay was full of dead fish, but they were out in the middle of the water. Elsa didn't break this up. It didn't make it worse. It just pushed those dead fish towards the shoreline where a lot more people live. But those pictures of dead Goliath grouper, we've been having them along, the Manatee County coastline for weeks before they showed up in St. Pete. So the dead fish weren't because of Elsa. Elsa pushed the dead fish towards the shoreline where more people lived.
I think you both have touched on this, but the question is, what can local governments do to help prevent these type of epic red tide or Lingvia blooms?
I think it gets back to addressing known issues where we do have aging infrastructure issues, both in our wastewater and stormwater management systems. I think addressing those and hedging off future sanitary sewer overflow events, or just properly using the reclaimed water that we do have within the region, that's the start that we need to start investing in and do a little bit better job of managing that more wisely in the future.
And somebody wants to know the number of dump truck equivalents to the tons of fish. So I'm not sure if you could do that on the spot, but if you can relate that. But I would say it's probably dump trucks from here all the way to St. Pete would have to be filled with dead fish.
I can't do it off the top of my head, but we're still have 2 months of the wet season remain, and we're about 2,000 tons of fish collected so far in the region. We collected about 2,700 back in the 2018 event, so there's still more time to collect additional fish that are now washing ashore from the Gulf side of the beaches.
That's about 10 tons of nitrogen, probably, something like that. So it's worthwhile getting those dead fish out of the system. That's 10 tons of nitrogen, and so that's a substantial amount of the nitrogen load that is kept from being the next generation of algae blooms.
And so while it's not a solution, it's one of those things that may be important as a playbook for a county or a city to have the resources and the methods of taking out the dead fish, because there were debates about that in the past, whether to remove them or not, but it's your opinion now that it's best to remove them.
But save your receipts. You should get reimbursed for it, and honestly, it's more cost effective than a stormwater pond. So it makes sense to get rid of it. It makes sense for someone to, reimburse you for it, but it does make sense to do it.
Thank you.
And it's a Band-Aid, but, sometimes you need a Band-Aid.
Yep. Okay, we're going to open up for question and answers. There's a microphone there, so if you would just kind of go to the microphone, and we'll start with the tables in the front and work our way to the back, if that's okay. And there's some questions that people have been asking about really land use items, and we're going to stay away from those because these are our scientists. We're dealing with questions having to do with red tide issues and Lingvia issues. And if you want to know a little bit about land use issues, we could discuss that a little later on in a different forum. But this forum is really focusing on the scientists and what they could bring to help guide policy as well as educate the community today. So, Marcy?
Marcial Powers. My nickname growing up was Marcy. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. We saw an article recently from Moat Marine that they say clay is supposed to help with the algae blooms, but then also I read clay can kill the oysters. Some people say the oysters can help with the red tide, but then the red tide kills the oysters. So what's our best recourse here?
Well, unless you're going to spray clay across, 250 square miles of Tampa Bay, I mean, it's not going to do much. And, it may be that it's helpful in like a canal or something like that, but unless you can isolate that canal, it's just going to come in there. So, I mean, literally, one of the problems I have with, any kind of like application like that is, if it's not scalable, then it's kind of like picking dead fish out of the bay. It's not a bad idea. It's just not going to solve your problem unless you're willing to, get crop dusters and put it across Tampa Bay, 250 square miles. It's not going to solve your problem. It'll maybe be helpful in a canal, but if that canal is not isolated from the rest of the water, it's just going to, the next tidal change, it'll be right back in there. So I think it's kind of neat. I just don't think it's very practical scaling it up.
And
that's my personal opinion.
Can you address the issue of the fallout? Is it an unknown as far as whether it would damage the ecosystem more, I think is the question?
We're actually supporting a project that is being conducted by Moat to look at that. So Moat is going to be doing these mesocosms, these large kind of like corrals in Sarasota Bay, and they're going to add that kind of clay, and we're going to see whether or not it causes more problems than it stops. And it's possible that it'll be benign, but even if it's benign, it's not necessarily scalable, then don't count on having the magic thing that'll make it go away. Red tide does kill it depends on the intensity and how long it's there. So oysters can clam up. Oysters can close up. Sorry. Clams can clam up too. Maybe I should clam up. So they can close for a while, and they won't necessarily die, but they shift to a type of metabolism that will use up all their fat reserves. So they can't do that forever. So if it doesn't last too long, it's not a big deal. But if the red tide lasts too long, then the oysters will starve to death by using all their resources.
We have to have you on the microphone if you're asking a question. Ed, go ahead.
I think just real quickly, I think, Dave touched on it. These are Band-Aids, and truly our success in the region has been attacking the source of the issue, and the source of the issue is the availability of nutrients to these blooms. So if we decrease the amount of nutrients in the future, and that's going to take a lot of work, the severity and the duration of these blooms will hopefully decrease through time. And it's a big lift. And it's not an easy fix. It's not an easy fix to just put clay out into the environment when we're responding to the event. We have to attack it at the source, and that has been where we've been successful in the past. And we just need to get back to that playbook in the region.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. What Ed just said, as far as reducing the loading, is probably the best bang for the dollar, right?
Yeah, for the vexing problems that we're now facing, that's the long view strategy. And there's really a good resource. It's called the Water Quality Playbook that was .org by the Community Foundation of Sarasota that really outlines all the different strategies that we need to embrace in the 21st century to address our coastal nutrient pollution problems in the region.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ted Teal, and I live in St. Pete Beach. I moved here in 2020, and I'm having trouble breathing when I go to the beach. I'm coughing a lot, and you guys made a very convincing argument for me that the Piney Point had an enormous impact, and yet on Wednesday morning the governor at a press conference essentially blamed Hurricane Elsa and downplayed Piney Point. And I was wondering, are you guys talking to him? Because it's clear that there's a disconnect about what is causing this enormous environmental issue.
I'd like to wade in there because I want to be very careful. I think the governor is saying things that he's told as well. So the conversation is bigger than us and the governor. No, I don't speak to the governor. But he's getting feedback from a group of scientists that not necessarily everyone agrees with. And we think that our experience in this system over the last 30, 35 years should weigh more heavily on the kind of advice that he's given about what's happening. So, when we talk about things, we're vetted through a TAC. I don't just give my opinion, I give an opinion that's been vetted through a group of people. So maybe what he needs is a broader group of experts to listen to. And that would be the way that I would put it. Elsa did not cause that fish kill. That fish kill was out there before Elsa. Elsa pushed the fish kill against St. Pete shoreline. So that fish kill had been around in waters for weeks before it got washed up against St. Pete. So, but maybe someone told him that. And I think maybe what we need is a broader group of people for him to listen to.
And I think it's really why we're here today, so that those concerns can be presented in a way with scientists in our local area, and hopefully that message gets back to people that are making decisions to the north of us in Tallahassee. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Susanna Young, and I grew up in Inglewood, Florida. And I have watched our bays and gulfs and rivers get dirtier and how's the word, by the year. So none of this is any surprise. I have a question. It hadn't been touched. It may be an obvious answer. How is this affecting the reproduction of fish? Baby fish nurseries.
Well, I wanted to hit your first thing. You said you were raised in Inglewood?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So Englewood, Lemon Bay, right? So Lemon Bay's water quality has been hit recently, but you know, Tampa Bay is cleaner than it was in the 70s and 80s, and so is Sarasota Bay. So it kind of, but to be cleaner is because it got worse. So, you know, we've had people living in our area pumping sewage into Sarasota Bay for decades. So we're not saying it's pristine, and it may not be as good, may not be as clean as it was a long time ago, but a lot of our systems are healthier than they were 20, 30 years ago because we used to do the right thing and we just kind of got away from it, took our eye off the ball. But the fish population question, you know, we lost habitat that supports about 30 million fish, and we lost it in 2 years. So there's going to be fewer fish in the next couple of years because we've lost so much habitat for them. That's number one thing that's going to happen.
Yeah, when the fish are dead, they can't reproduce, and the location, the location of this particular red tide bloom being in Tampa Bay, and estuaries, by definition, are juvenile fish habitat. They're nursery areas for a lot of the important game fish that our inshore recreational and commercial recreational guides depend on, the snook, redfish, trout. The red tide in Tampa Bay is killing those young juvenile fish. So they're not going to make it to the fishery and reproduce later on in the stage. So again, these impacts aren't going to play out until a year or so down the road in terms of higher levels of the ecosystem. But we know our bay is still resilient. We're not back to like 1950 or 1970s conditions in terms of the amount of seagrass in Tampa Bay. We've lost seagrass, but there's still areas where you know, resilience to this bloom will hopefully occur. But if we have another red tide bloom or a significant algal bloom next year, we had one in 2018. We're dealing with an event in 2021. If we have another one next year, that's where the system can spiral out of control, and we might end up like the situation that the Indian River Lagoon is facing. And that's where we don't want to be.
I had one more, a little question. The the sewer main on Longboat, is it Longboat Key or on this side that broke? Was it last winter?
Yeah.
And
last summer.
Spewed, and apparently nobody was notified for what, 2 weeks? Could that have affected or added to the, I mean, the currents carry it north, or I don't know how the currents go.
Yeah, that was one of the things I worked on, and so basically that that sewer leak happened. That pipeline is about 50 years old. That pipeline was supposed to have another couple of decades in it, but it didn't. And that pipeline leak occurred where there was a branch that was rubbing up against the bottom of it, kind of, and it wore through there. That leak occurred about 400 feet into mangrove fringe, and it looks like the mangrove fringe did a pretty good job of filtering out a lot of the contaminants. So we were there right after that leak was closed. Right after it was closed, you know, several days after it first started, but we didn't find any sign of pollution in the bay, probably because it occurred in a wetland. Wetlands have been used for treating wastewater, you know, in third world countries and elsewhere. So we're fortunate that it happened where it happened. If it happened in the middle of the bay, totally different story, though. That leak occurred in a timeline that doesn't explain what happened with the loss of seagrass, because it happened after the seagrass loss already happened. The 2018 red tide started in the summer of 2018. That leak happened in 2019, in the summer of 2019. So it didn't cause that die-off, but if it was a leak in the middle of the bay, it would have been really bad, because it would have been hard to find, it would have been hard to fix. So to their credit, Longboat Key is looking to replace that system as quickly as possible, and I believe they're trying to get it, you know, completed by 2025 or earlier. It's a priority for us.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Chris Self. I live in St. Pete Beach. I have a two-part question for you. It's all well and good for us to be informed and to wring our hands and say we got to do something, but I'm an action person. I think we're all in 100% agreement that something has to be done to Piney Point. What are the steps that we can start taking to move this project forward? Has it been defined? How do we get involved in closing that down? And then my other question is, what can we do about the city of St. Pete dumping sewage and their sewage spills? How can we get involved in doing something about that? Steps of action is what I'm looking for.
Yeah, so it takes investments to address those sanitary sewer overflow issues, like Dave was mentioning with the pipeline failure. We have known areas where we have aging infrastructure issues that are causing infiltration into our wastewater collection systems that are exacerbating our wastewater treatment plants. That's an easy fix. It just costs money, and we have to go into those places, retrofit some of those areas with improved infrastructure. Piney Point, you know, action is, if this was any other facility that had an emergency discharge, if it was a public wastewater treatment plant, there'd probably be a consent order for closure of that facility or some corrective actions needed to fully close out that site. So I think continuing to make it clear that, you know, we don't want this to happen again at that facility, and making sure there's full and final closure plan, you know, to fully get rid of the remaining wastewater burden on that site. I think just being transparent about it, what that action calls for is what is needed in our region.
I'd like to give a shout out. You know, in my experience with you know, dealing with what's happening here, I think Manatee County has stepped up more so than any other entity on this. I mean, they were wanting to get rid of this problem before it existed, and it's not their permit. It's not their regulatory requirement to fix this problem, but they were stepping up before that. And of all the data collection, the vast majority of it's been from Manatee County. And I just want to basically say they've been stepping up to the plate since this has blown up on them. And all credit to them for actually, and Administrator Dr. Hopes over there kind of said that it was going to be their goal, they intend to meet, to have no further releases into the bay. And that's not going to be easy to do, but we didn't get that from the state. We got that from the county as you know, kind of a pledge. And they've really done a great job. And I'm not sure everyone has put as much effort into it as is required, but I think the county has.
My name is Barbara Baker, and I would like to have your thoughts on what are the advantages of pairing the mature clams with the seagrass to encourage that growth.
Yeah, so we've actually invested in some research working with the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and also with the Gulf Shellfish Institute to see if targeted shellfish restoration might have a benefit in terms of water quality. And it's a mixed bag of results. I think in dealing with some of our issues in Old Tampa Bay, there might be an opportunity to do really targeted either clam or oyster restoration to preclude that particular algal species from occurring. Red tide is a totally different beast in terms of dealing with clams and oysters in terms of alleviating future red tide events. It's probably not going to be as effective for that particular bloom. So it's still an option on the table, but if we're not addressing the root source of the issue, it's just another Band-Aid that isn't going to potentially fix, you know, the core issue that we're facing with these algal blooms.
In Sarasota Bay, we've paid for deployment of large numbers of clams in the bay, and we're going to continue to do that. We just don't think that that's going to solve our problem. It can't hurt at all, and we have no problem with, you know, funding that kind of effort. But we do have a problem if someone overpromises what it's going to do. It's not going to fix our water quality problem. It's going to be a good idea, but it's been tested and it doesn't fix our water quality problem. It's just a good idea, and maybe we need to do more. We're going to be open-minded about it, but it's never a bad idea to have more filter feeders, but we don't want to overpromise what it'll do for us.
Well, is it true that then the clams do survive, the mature clams do survive the red tide and then can continue to be effective? Is that true?
To an extent, yes.
Have we had issues where the clams have died from red tide, and what's the negative impacts from that?
I don't know if we have any data on that, but
We have a lot of dead clams in places where we put a lot of clams, and I don't know if that's a normal mortality, but if you go into parts of the bay where we put a lot of clams, there are a lot of dead clams as well. And that's not unexpected, you know. A good number of us will be dead in 10 years, so hopefully not me. But what it does mean is that, like, you know, you put 400,000 clams in water, a certain amount of them are going to die, and we want to make sure that it's not 50%, because that wouldn't be a good idea.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name's Henry Bruce from Seminole. I just moved down from Connecticut in the Long Island Sound, and my neighbor was Terry Backer, who many of you probably know as the Long Island Sound keeper. So I've got a lot of familiarity with water treatment, and what concerns me of what I've heard today is you talk about a 57% reduction in nitrogen. It sounds to me like the 35 pounds of COVID weight I gained over the last 18 months that I got to lose. And my concern is I watch what the sound keepers down, or the water keepers down here are doing, and what brings action is lawsuits. And that's a big job. And I look at what Suncoast has done in Tampa Bay, and I mean, you guys do some amazing work down here with very little resources. And my concern is that the problem can be very overwhelming. I'd like to hear some things that would make me feel a little bit more comfortable about this, but I just, you know, to the municipal people in the room, there's a lot of bad actors all around the country, and Tampa Bay, and so like what can be done to bring action, as the woman just asked for, that would be a little bit more expedient?
So, you know, some of the information I showed with those pies, you know, there's been action. So, you know, we were loading the bay with 9,000 tons of nutrients. We reduced that in the early 1990s to about 3,000 tons, so about 2/3 reductions in the total amount of nutrients going into the bay. That took a long time to get there, and it took a lot of money and investments in our wastewater treatment plants to get there. So even if we start investing now, we're not going to reap the rewards and benefits probably for a decade to come. So we need to take action now, and people need to be motivated to take action now, because if we continue to sit on this problem, it's only going to be more expensive to fix and create solutions in the future.
And I think that, like, you know, when you look at problems you have with wastewater treatment plants, most systems don't have a problem. City of Sarasota has been plumbing along, and they're a big reason why Sarasota Bay, you know, had a big improvement. And yeah, there are problems, but it's not like a wastewater operator is sitting around waiting for the opportunity to screw up the bay. You know, they're dealing with aging infrastructure, and they're dealing with tight budgets. And I honestly would never want to be elected official, because people get in front of them and yell at them and say, I need money for this, I need money for that, I need money for this, I need money for that. And so the regulatory arena, as I kind of look at it, should be to make the elected officials realize that something needs to be invested to keep with their permits. So wastewater treatment plant problems we had with Sarasota County, it wasn't because someone wanted to do that. They didn't have the money to fix the system. The city of Sarasota's major flow into that plant is not in the wintertime when the population is higher, it's in the summertime. It's in the summertime because the pipes are so leaky. It's called infiltration and inflow. And so they can't afford to fix every pipe because there's too many hundreds of miles of them. So what they do is they build the facility to be able to handle more water than what people flush down their toilets and empty in their bathtubs and showers and that, because so much of the water is coming in because our pipes are so leaky. And that's because we laid our pipes decades ago. We just don't have a wastewater infrastructure that can handle the population growth and the aging that we've got. And so these guys are dealing with not enough money to fix an aging infrastructure with a growing population. And they don't want to be this way. It's embarrassing to be that way. A lot of them spend a lot of time on the bay. But you know, if you don't have regulatory oversight, then you may not know that they have these problems. And that's where I appreciate what you guys have done, because you've highlighted what should have been highlighted by a regulatory agency. So the plant operators don't want this to happen, but when it does happen, it has to be brought to people's attention earlier. It shouldn't have taken 5 years for the problem with Bee Ridge plant to be acted upon, and it did. And those 5 years set us back 20 years. And it's now being acted upon, which is great, but it also shouldn't have taken 5 years for that to be identified and acted upon.
But I also want to compliment the elected officials that are here, because it gives them an opportunity to maybe prioritize infrastructure improvements, because wastewater plants are funded with their sewage fees. And so every year they could increase those fees to accommodate taking care of some of these problems. And I believe St. Pete just did that recently after they were found not in compliance with their rules. So it shouldn't have to take an organization to challenge a government to follow the rules. And the prioritization during these hearings or these meetings where a consultant comes up and says, this is what I recommend. Ask the question, are there problems that we're talking about today that need to be corrected, and how much will that cost? And then the sidebar effect is that you have a lot of citizens that don't want to pay any extra money, but then they don't want red tide either, or Lingvia blooms. So it's a circle. So I just want to throw that out there, that there is monies that can be allocated. It just hasn't been in the past. And with sea level rise, things will only get worse, especially in the island communities, which I know they're working on plans to stop the infiltration into their sewer systems.
And the funding has changed too. A lot of these wastewater upgrades took place when the federal government was a much bigger partner in paying for these things, and it's just not that way. Sarasota County is looking at ratepayers paying the majority of $500 million. And then, in the 1970s, when a lot of these upgrades happened, the ratepayers wouldn't have to pay as large of a portion of it because the feds would pick up a larger portion. So that, federal government involvement with infrastructure planning has just dropped off a cliff lately.
Yeah, and I agree with what we've been talking about, and I want to stress something that maybe Dave has certainly mentioned, is I think that there's been a failure of enforcement at the state level and federal level. Municipalities need support. They also need to further embrace making environmental investments. I think communities need to understand and support those investments. I think one of the big things that's been lacking here, which triggers our enforcement actions, is a failure of effective enforcement at the state and federal level. So if they don't enforce permits, and we know that permits are derived by with science as to what a water body can absorb as far as pollution. And if municipalities and other polluters, be it private or public, aren't complying with those permits, we need enforcement. And so we'll continue to do that and play that role. If there is a lack of enforcement at the state or federal level, we'll step in their shoes.
My name's Mike O'Neill. I'm a resident in Cortez. And it's my understanding that officials with the DEP have come out stating that they're against the plans for the mining company to drill down and inject materials from Piney Point into the aquifer. And I wanted to get your opinion on that situation and whether you think that's the right approach to closing that.
I have no opinion. I'm not a hydrogeologist.
Yeah,
I'll just flat out say that.
Yeah, it's kind of outside of the questions. I can tell you that when Piney Point was dealt with back in about 15 years ago, they did remove all that water through a combination of methods, and I don't believe any of them were ground injection of that water. There was ocean disposal, there was other methods. Some actually went into the bay. So if you're asking the question, are there alternatives, I think that answer is yes. And if you're trying to encourage some of the people in this room today to look at those alternatives, I think they hear you.
I wondered if you'd comment on these other factors that affect the bay. The currents, I didn't hear any mention of the sea currents. It surprised me when the Plume came out that it went up into Tampa Bay because I was expecting to get it down in Sarasota Bay, and we haven't so far. Also, you have, I know the county in the last few years has been very concerned about stormwater drainage, and they've been cleaning out pipes, and I've noticed how brown the water's gotten where I am. The fish are still there, and even the manatees. You always have sedimentation. That's increasing, and of course you have landfills in the flood zone, big ones. There's plans for 10,000 homes with La Flores. I think in Aqua by the Bay, it's 3,800 units will go in there. I noticed that they put at least, I've talked to the person that did it, 1,000 truckloads raising the elevation of the land. That reduces the surface area. If we're talking square miles. And finally, we have just the effect of one hurricane. I think I was out there in October when last year when whatever was coming through was a storm. And as those waves build in shallow water, they get steep, and they just are going to rip up everything. And it's hurricane season again. We could have what are the effects of one storm, for example, to the seagrass? That could probably wipe things out. That's a lot, I realize. So
we'll let them answer the question on the currents, because I don't think we've touched on that. So that's a good question.
Well, we know sort of where the plume trajectory is going because of a lot of the good work that's been done by USF to understand currents and tides in the bay. So that has helped us plan where we need to monitor. It has helped us understand where we anticipate impacts from discharges to occur. But holistically, you know, all the things you mentioned, you know, a lot of the things we talked about in terms of nutrient management are for the benefit of seagrass and in-bay water quality. But our strategies are diverse in the watershed as well. We have targets for emergent tidal wetlands, mangrove, marsh, coastal wetlands, freshwater wetlands. All that's a piece of the pie. All that needs to be addressed in the remaining opportunities for coastal restoration that we have within the region before it becomes a subdevelopment. Those living, breathing ecosystems are only going to aid in our efforts to manage holistically the bay. So, you know, the targets for water quality and seagrass are one thing, but holistically, we also have targets for the host of important habitats that create a healthy Tampa Bay watershed and ecosystem. So, you know, you got to keep the eye on the prize in terms of things that can occur within the watershed that discharges ultimately to the bay and affects water quality conditions as well.
I just want to touch on like the new development, you know, pressures are kind of like a red herring, I think, to a certain degree, because, you know, I live across the bridge in a place called River Bay Townhomes, and we were built more recently, I think 2006 or so, and because of built more recently, we weren't allowed to destroy the mangrove fringe. It was required to protect the mangrove fringe. So we don't have finger-fill canals dug into, you know, our shoreline to put houses. We're all on sewer over there. And our reclaimed water comes back from the city of Palmetto, and it's applied at a rate it's disposing of effluent that doesn't have to go into the bay. So new development oftentimes is less damaging than the old development. I mean, I was at a meeting one time where someone was complaining about some new development, and I went to their house, and it was a finger-fill canal. There's no mangroves there. It's all seawall, and they're on a septic tank. And I'm thinking, yeah, you know what? This is the kind of stuff that got us into a lot of the problems, and we don't have that. So new development isn't always the problem, because new development has to abide by stormwater rules that didn't exist prior to 1980. And it's more likely to have less of a problem per acre in pollutant load generation than the old development. So the way you hold the line on pollutant loads is you reduce the impact of new development, and you can do that. If Manatee County has development and they're careful with wastewater and careful with stormwater and careful with the irrigation, it can be less of an impact than the existing development. If you want to hold the line, you got to retrofit the existing older development, because they're generating more pollution per rainfall unit than new development. So it's not like new development. There are more people living in Tampa Bay now than there were in the 1970s, and yet we were a cleaner bay. Population growth doesn't necessarily cause more pollution. It's how you handle it. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. I'm not against more people moving our watershed if we're careful about how that growth is accommodated. And we have to do more with our existing development, because they don't have the stormwater treatment systems. And they might be on septic tanks when maybe it's okay, maybe it's not okay. So it's a false narrative to say new development is causing our problems. New development may be part of the problem, but so is existing development.
We have a question from somebody about atmospheric deposition and how much that contributes to the problems with the nitrogen that we're experiencing in our water bodies.
Yeah, depending on any given year, it's about 20% of the load to Tampa Bay. So certainly as we improve in terms of our emissions, that will certainly have an impact on the amount of nutrients that are falling on the water surface and the land surface that ultimately washes to the bay. So,
and where does it come from, the atmospheric deposition?
You know, the emissions from both, you know, power plant generation and some of the fixed sources, as well as all the cars that are on a road. You know, those are the emissions that we're talking about. There's nitrogen in those tailpipes from fossil fuel combustion that ultimately make its way back into our watershed. So that nitrogen has an effect and contributes to the total amount of sources available to the algae and water quality conditions in the bay.
So in Sarasota, we have a long-term gauge at Verno Wellfield, and our atmospheric deposition, our nitrogen concentrations are going down. Our air is cleaner now than it has been in prior decades in Sarasota, because a lot of the power plants have moved from coal to natural gas, which is a cleaner burning fuel. Cars are actually, there's more cars, but they're getting better mileage. So my first car was a Chevy Malibu, got 8 miles per gallon. Now I'm driving a Subaru with like 30. I used to have a Chevy Volt that actually didn't use any gas. So people, again, are driving cleaner cars, and our power generation is cleaner, and our air is actually getting better. The other part is atmospheric deposition is a big load because it's 4 feet of rain that lands on top of your bay, but it's a different type of load than, like, for example, Piney Point. So atmospheric deposition is a lot of nitrogen, but it's loaded in a very different way than 200 pounds of high concentration. It's a lot that occurs over 4 months at a low concentration. So it's important to note, but it's not the most important load.
Some people are questioning the importance of declaring an emergency, like if the governor declared an emergency, state of an emergency, would that help with whatever you're doing with funds or additional research, or don't you want to answer that?
I think most of the counties have been interfacing with, as they've been getting support from the state at this point. Whether or not declaring an emergency would change our response to this current red tide bloom, I'm not sure at this point, but I know Pinellas County is getting support in terms of their fish kill efforts. I know Hillsborough County is now looking at ways to tap into resources if they have to respond to and collect additional fish along their county shorelines, and I'm sure Manatee County has been having those discussions on their emergency operations. So we know it's out there. We just have to weather the storm at this point, and as long as those resources don't dry up with the continued effort, then I don't know if it's going to be necessary at this point.
I mean, most of the work, fish kill collection, everything that's being done by city and county staff, and as long as someone reimburses it, I don't see just as long as the state reimburses them, because it's their permit. Piney Point was a state permit, and as long as the state helps to reimburse the local governments, I don't really have an opinion one way or the other on what would help, as long as they get repaid, because they should. It shouldn't be the county and cities doing this and not getting reimbursed. They should get reimbursed because it's not their permit; it's a state permit.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions? Yes.
Sorry, I get kind of nervous standing up in front of people too. So a client of mine has this product, and I don't know who I'm supposed to talk to about it, but it's a synthetic sponge that's hydrophobic but absorbs anything with hydrocarbon molecule. And I think that it could really help with our waterways and our pollution in the ocean, which obviously would help with everything else. So I don't know.
Well, these are the right people
That's
to,
what I was thinking, so here I am.
Tell them about that, so maybe afterwards you
That's what I was
give them some
hoping
more
for.
information
Thank you.
about that. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was being upstaged there. My name is David Woodhouse. I am a hydrogeologist, and I think the county commissioners know me. I've certainly been putting my 2 cents in regarding certainly Mosaic. What happens to the pollution in the ground? And unfortunately, if you looked at Florida, there's a ridge that runs north and south through the center of Florida. East, everything goes to the Atlantic, and west, it goes to the Gulf of Mexico. So everything we throw into the ground goes through the limestone here, which is highly fractured. It's one of the forces of nature, the geologic phenomena, that run to that limestone, so you could drive a truck through it here and there. We have sinkholes, but all the water, pollution, whatever here, discharges into Tampa Bay in the Gulf of Mexico. There's no if, buts, or know-how. And we look at Piney Point, where we discharge millions of gallons of wastewater. I guess we saw what happened. And this will continue on until we address the fact that we cannot keep dumping everything into the ground. Now, Carinea brevis needs phosphorus and nitrogen. The phosphorus, obviously, could come from industry. The nitrogen, well, there's thousands and thousands of septic tanks that produce nitrogen. And all that eventually is what they call it upwells. It flows to the streams and ultimately to the Gulf. And there's no escaping it until you recognize what's going on below the ground. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly a strategy that needs to be addressed. There are known septic hotspot areas where if we convert some of those old infrastructure to centralized sewer will have a benefit in terms of loading to our groundwater systems. And certainly anything we're doing in terms of disposal of water to the groundwater system, we want to make sure it's treated to high enough quality so that it's not also going to have a downstream impact through the groundwater system as well. I think you make a valid point.
So I want to chime in here as well, because septic tanks will get a bigger crowd than anything else you deal with, and you need more data because not all septic tanks are a problem. They're really not, and there's models that assume they are, and they're not always right. So we had a pollutant loading model for Philippi Creek, which is the main source of fresh water inflow to Sarasota Bay. And we've had a series of loading models that kind of predicted how much of the nitrogen load came from septic tanks. And the answers we have are 20%, 50%, 6%, and 5%. So you're a county commissioner. Which one of those are you going to believe? And the answer is we don't know which one of them is right because we've never collected the data in the groundwater to look at it. City of Tampa and the City of Sarasota use a process to get rid of nitrogen that turns it back into the air. So take a deep breath, right? And 78% of what you just sucked into your lungs is nitrogen. So why are we worried about nitrogen if it's like the atmosphere? Because this nitrogen doesn't cause an algal bloom. It's dinitrogen gas. It's biologically inert. The nitrogen that comes out of fertilizer, that comes out of your toilet, that can cause an algal bloom. So what a wastewater treatment plant does is it turns that nasty nitrogen, algal fuel, into this benign form. And those same processes can occur in soils. So septic tanks, I've been to places where there's 300 septic tanks in small lots, quarter-acre lots in Captiva, and our average nitrogen concentration was 1.1. That's what a mangrove fringe is. Where did all the nitrogen go? It went back up to the atmosphere. Soils can promote significant amounts of denitrification. So if you're under pressure to get rid of septic tanks, understand why you do it. The reason why Sarasota County is moving forward with the septic tank replacement is not because of nitrogen, it's because of pathogens. Because we found viruses that can only come from humans. We found bacteria that can only come from humans. It's a wastewater issue from a pathogen standpoint, not a nitrogen. Septic tanks don't always cause a problem because they can have soil processes that can get that nitrogen and turn it into this benign stuff in the air. That's what the city of Tampa does. That's what the city of Palmetto does. That's what the city of Sarasota does. They replicate in an industrial setting the phenomena that can occur in our soils. They're not always a problem. Make sure you understand what it is that you're trying to get rid of. If it's a pathogen problem, might make a lot of sense, but they're not always a nitrogen source.
One sentence? Yeah. I forgot to mention, Eric Crown, who's a filmmaker, has made a film about this area here and the role of industry in contaminating Tampa Bay and so on and so forth. It's going to be released July 27th in theaters, I assume nationwide. I'm in it. I'm up for the Academy Award, I heard, but... So you'll be the first to know. Thank you.
Thank you. So
it's called Phosphate, F-A-T-E.
Phosphate.
Right.
Thank you. We'll put that
it
up.
It talks about a lot about mosaic and what goes on around here, and so we'll see.
Thank you. We'll put that on our website, and just to remind you folks that we're going to wrap up, and we'll be putting this recording up on our website as well, the Suncoast Waterkeeper and the Tampa Bay Waterkeeper, and maybe you guys can get it up on the Estuary Program website. And I want folks to recognize. And I appreciate so much the two of these gentlemen who are brilliant and courageous, and they're an incredible resource for our communities. And I think we're really, really lucky to have them. Thank you for coming here today, and thank you for the work that you do. And I have two little kids, and I want them to be able to grow up and enjoy these waterways. And I'm setting the bar really high, but like when I think of like what do I want my kids to do when they grow up, I'm like, I want to be scientists that are helping to protect our waterways, and so anyway, I'm.
Get ready to support them the rest of
the time. Yeah, that's a lot of education. But thank you all very, very much for attending. I'm glad that that's one of the things that the Waterkeeper programs can do. I mean, you know about some of the things that we do, but we can just help to highlight important information and be a resource of information. And So, but please do also support our efforts. You know, we're on very tight budgets with no staff and are able to accomplish a lot with the support of folks like you. So if you get the chance to go to our website, our social media, become members, contribute, thank you very much.